Who we are, according to mythology, is a story trying to be born into the world. A living story. That is a quote from Michael Meade, and this is my video on Michael Meade and elders versus olders. And our culture has suffered from many wars, deaths, traumas, and the destruction over 2,000 years, the destruction of myths, legends. It also destroys these individuals within these cultures, and it corrupts their destiny. The absence of myth and folklore and history and culture has led to the decline of moral character among those living in the world today. Hence, the NPC, the non-player character meme, or mass man, has become the majority. Presently, our societies are suffering so badly from this. But there is a cure. The cure is right before us and in us. We just need a little imagination. Another thing that has been destroyed by the instructors of today's children. Instruct means to pack in, where education means to lead out. And the true teacher or mentor leads out that which is already there inside the student. What are they to lead out exactly? The inner myth, destiny, and truth that wants to emerge within the child, student, or apprentice. Quote, mythology, which now tends to mean in common parlance something false, actually means emergent truth. It's Michael Meade again. Quote, inside every young person is a soul on whose walls words are already written, and the job of the teacher is to trigger the awakening of the language already embedded in the soul of the student. End quote. The lack of such teachings has led to a deficit in the population of elders. So what is an elder? An elder is someone who holds on to the past and who can bring that past back to life through myth, poetry, tales, and legends. Quote, what are elders? They are the people whose sight has fallen so that their vision can grow. They are the people whose short-term memory has disappeared so that their long-term depth of the river of memory that goes back to the beginning and therefore predicts and helps the future to occur. That's the elder. The older simply loses sight and loses memory and loses the keys and can't remember where the car is anyways. That end quote. That's Michael Meade again. This is from a presentation he did back in, I think, in the early 2000s at the Pacifica Graduate Institute, and it's called Images of Initiation, I believe. I wrote this a while ago, about a year ago I wrote this, and I was going to try and bring it out in a different way, but this is the way. I couldn't wait anymore. I got to bring it out because I really like it, and I think it's pertinent. And so to give an example of an elder, not from ancient myth, but from a modern one, Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. As Lorelei Scaife puts it in The Lord of the Rings is the guiding myth of our time and the dream of Western civilization. And Lorelei Scaife, she is an astrologer, a Jungian, and she also spent time with James Hillman and Michael Meade. And she has some great... she has a great documentary on her channel that she made that uses sort of Jungian dream analysis to break down the three movies of the Lord of the Rings, and she uses amplification and techniques like that to analyze all the characters. It's really amazing. I suggest people check it out. I'll put a link below for sure. And she has other interviews out there as well. She did one with David Whitehead a few years back, and they were really good as well. And to quote back to Michael Meade here, quote, myth is the return of the timeless to the time-bound, end quote. And that's what that myth is, I think. This Lord of the Rings is bringing this timelessness back to us. And Tolkien, he read ancient languages, and these languages sort of brought these stories out within him. So, and he didn't even take credit for the stories. He just kind of said he was copying them and writing them down. But it's really good. If anyone hasn't read them, I suggest they do. But I think most people have at least seen the movies, so I hope this isn't too out there. But there's not too much quoting here from the book. And I want to explain what makes this Bilbo Baggins an elder in the first place. And what he is. He's a hobbit. He stays home, he drinks tea, he smokes his pipe. But one day, the wind of destiny blows in his direction, and he chooses to follow where it leads. And the wind in this case is the wizard Gandalf, who is the mentor leading out the destiny within Bilbo. And I think at one point in the films or in the movies or in the books, I'm trying to think of which one, if it was the cartoon or the actual film, he just says that it only took a little push to get him out the door. And now to quote from Michael Meade here, "The deepest level of memory is not just recollection of the past. At the deepest level, memory is also prophecy. The depth of memory is the flow back to the origin of the world. And when in touch with that, one is almost automatically in touch with prophecy." End quote. And this explains the character of Gandalf perfectly. As for Bilbo, he faces many perils. He puts his life on the line many times on this journey. He finds a magic ring in a deep cave within the Misty Mountains. And in that cave, he faces this creature Gollum, who represents his shadow. And he bests him in a game of riddles, of wits. And so he has been in the underworld, has faced his shadow, and survived another part of the hero's journey. He is now an initiate into the mysteries. I think that's kind of what the ring sort of symbolized too, with him finding it. Later, once he saves his own life and slays a spider in the forest of Mirkwood, he has found his inner strength. And to quote from The Hobbit, "Somehow the killing of the giant spider all alone, by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves or anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person, and much fiercer and bolder." End quote. He cleans the blade of his sword, and then he names it Sting. And the sword in these tales represents the masculine power or the phallic power. It happens in The Lord of the Rings as well with the sword that was broken, but I won't go into that here. Later, after he rescues his companions from the webs of the spiders, quote, "Bilbo began to feel there really was something of a bold adventurer about himself after all. He goes on to do many great things in the story." End quote. He goes on to do many great things in the story, including steal treasure from a dragon. The facing of the dragon is a classic motif in the hero's journey. He has faced his death and knows what it is like to conquer fear, or to go on in spite of it, which is the true meaning of courage. I think back behind me there is actually the dragon and Bilbo, a picture that J.R.R. Tolkien actually drew. And after facing the dragon, he has the ability to do what is right even though it is difficult. And that is what the hero does. To quote Michael Meade again here, quote, "To live what is called the bigger life, the mythic life, to risk being in situations where the uncertainty of the moment causes the inner language to break out of one's own soul and to be renounced in the world. When the student sees the teacher doing that, their genius for living awakens." End quote. Bilbo is not just a mentor to the main character in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo, but to these other 3 hobbits as well. So there's 4 hobbits that he mentors, which I find is like kind of a Jungian. The 4 is big with young. But while these 4 are on their own journey, they're in an old ruin being led around by this ranger strider who seems to know his way around ancient lore, and they sort of ask him what this structure is. This is in the book Lord of the Rings. Quote, "Amon Sul they called it. Once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there watching for the coming of Gilgalad out of the west in the days of the last alliance." End quote. And when the hobbits ask who Gilgalad was, they get an answer in the form of a poem, which the reader believes is this character Strider, who, quote, was learned in old lore, end quote. But to everyone's surprise, it's the gardener Sam. This is where he explains that Bilbo has taught him not only how to read and write, but also myths and legends of ancient times, as well as songs and poems. The quote from Michael Meade here again, quote, "Another aspect of myth and perhaps education is poetry. The natural speech of the human soul is both poetic and mythical," end quote. The other hobbits are also initiated into the mysteries of life by seeing Bilbo use his magic ring and he disappears, and the other one follows him to see that he's communicating with these elves, and so they become initiated. The world is bigger than they thought it was. And to quote here from Michael Meade again, I think I'll just quote from him for the rest of the time. Quote, "Education is the attempt to touch again and again the destiny carried both by teacher and student, and then, if it happens long enough, instead of just becoming old, the teacher and the learners, the students, become elders. Another way of understanding what is happening in the culture is that this is what happens when you have olders instead of elders," end quote. And I'm just going to quote from him one last time here. Quote, "When a culture forgets the origins of life, and when a culture forgets that you're supposed to grow elders who know how to stand at the door of death and make decisions that help the next generation, when a culture forgets that, then the older people in the culture forget themselves," end quote. And when I was writing this, and last year or so, I was rereading The Lord of the Rings, and I couldn't help but notice the difference, or the similarities, and how well Bilbo fit the bill of this mentor. And so that's when I started kind of writing this together. Excuse me. And the hobbits in the book go on to have their own hero's journey, and in the end they become wise elders of their own community. And that is what is important about this topic, I feel, is that we shall be someone's ancestors one day. And if we are taking right action in the world and going on the hero's journey ourselves and writing our own stories, then we can strive to be the elders for the next generation, because we need them. We need them out there. Well, I don't know. Yeah, we need these elders, and so we have to start striving. We're going to be someone's ancestors someday. Start acting correctly. Start shoring yourself up. That's what I'm always talking about. And I want to read this poem from Bilbo. It's interesting. This book, The Lord of the Rings, takes place at the end of an age and the start of a new age, and there's all this turmoil. And it really reminds me of our times. It's amazing. But I want to read this poem from this book from Bilbo, because it just struck me as an amazing poem that he wrote. So here we go. Here's Bilbo's poem. "I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, of meadow flowers and butterflies in summer that have been, of yellow leaves and gossamer in autumns that there were, with morning mists and silver sun and wind upon my hair. I sit beside the fire and think of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall never see. For still there are so many things that I have never seen. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. But all the while I sit and think of times there were before. I listen for returning feet and voices at my door." I always get shivers when I read that last part. But yeah, I just thought that was a perfect way to end this video, is with this poem by Bilbo. And You know, again, I said in the last video I made with Martin, you know, these growing pains of this new age is the turmoil we're seeing right now. And if we can just all hang in there and start shoring ourselves up and start creating these communities together and become the elders that we need to be and become these heroes and do what we need to do in spite of the fear. If you have fear, you gotta do what you gotta do. And that is what courage is. And so with that, I'll end the video now, and I'll put the links below and to Laura Lee's stuff as well, because those documentaries she makes are absolutely amazing. Okay, have a good evening, and this is Luke Renda. Feel the link.